everyone. Thanks for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stella. I'm a first descendant of the Crow Nation, and I'm from Bozeman. I'm really grateful to be participating in this residency, and it's my first activity as a real artist since graduating from the University of Montana this spring. So I'm really excited about that and glad to connect with people in this very odd and distant time. So I guess I'll start out by giving you kind of a vague statement about my work. I value aesthetics, critical thought, and concept in my work, but above all, I seek connection to others, to the earth, connection to my own identity and the history of my ancestors. A lot of the time I like to incorporate humor into my work because I feel like laughter is one of the best ways to bring people together. And you can kind of see that here through the badger pillar and handbird. But a lot of the work that I've generated so far at my time here at Home ReSource is actually very serious business. In light of the current national and global events such as the Black Lives Matter movement, the pandemic and how it's disproportionately affected Indigenous communities, the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement, and media fights over changing Native American-based mascots, my indigeneity has been at the forefront of my mind. And I've been thinking a lot about its impacts on my life as a human and as an artist. And a lot of the work that I've created so far at Home ReSource is reflective of this. So I want to start our talk today by going over some recurring imagery that appears in my work. And then I'll give a brief description of how I'm using it to address some of the issues which are important to me and to Indigenous communities across the United States and Canada at this time. And after that, I'll open it up for any questions that you might have. But at the same time, feel free to stop me if I get really flustered and you don't understand what I'm trying to say. Okay, so I'll start out by explaining one of the motifs which I'm asked about probably the most out of everything, maybe because I use it the most, and that is the handbird, which appears here and on that one there, and I have a little pin on my hat of it. And all I have to say about that is it's a self-portrait, obviously. Just kidding. But it is actually a self-portrait. I'm really drawn to narrative art, and I use these handbirds to tell my story and the story that other countless mixed-race Indigenous people across the United States and Canada are facing today. There's a few things about these handbirds which are important to me, and oh, yes. Okay. Yes. So a few things that are important to them are the fact that they're made out of hands. And I'll start with that. I made them have hands for wings because my hands are really important to me, you know, for eating pasta with when I'm socially afraid. And also for creating my artwork. Because as you've probably noticed by now, I'm kind of belligerently shy and my voice is pretty squeaky when I'm speaking, so I have a lot of thoughts and I like to connect with people, but that's a big part of why I primarily choose to share my voice through writing and visual art. And without my hands, I wouldn't be able to connect with people in the way that I know how to best. The next thing that I want to talk about in the handbirds is my use of color. It's important to the handbirds, but it's also applicable to a lot of my work that's been generated over this residency, as well as my time before that at the University of Montana. So to get into the color, I'd like to talk about my mom. She's a really talented bead worker, which is important to my tribe, as well as a lot of other Indigenous communities. And my first introduction to art when I was a kid was through her work. So I have a lot of memories growing up watching her bead. Like, she had this cool little fanny pack that she'd bring full of beading supplies, and like if I was swimming or something with my brother, she'd just get out the beadwork and start working on it. So a lot of my inspiration for the projects I've been working on are drawn from her beadwork, like the colors that she uses, and my knowledge of beading. But in addition to that, I've been dedicating a lot of time to researching historical use of colors in Crow designs, but also just in Indigenous culture in general. And in the coming weeks, I hope to more explicitly incorporate aspects of beadwork into my imagery. And while I've been researching the historical uses of colors, so far I found multiple meanings for things in the Crow history, but as well as other indigenous communities, such as the color red, which is it's become really important to the missing and murdered indigenous women movement. And one interpretation of the meaning of red was shared by the Social Justice Project and podcast called Red House. And their explanation really resonated with me, and some of the work that I've made here reflects that idea. So I'm going to share a quote with you about the color red and what it means to some of the indigenous communities across the United States and Canada. Many of you have likely seen the red handprint through social media, as many indigenous women have dedicated posts to share their reasons for advocating the safety of our kin. We often get questions about what it means, and we wanted to gather thoughts and feedback from our community. The handprint has been explained as a representation of the silence that these victims face. Despite the high numbers and incredible risk for indigenous women to go missing, very little is being done by people in power. The color red is the color that our ancestors can see and that those who have walked on can see. Therefore, the red handprint calls on help to guide back the missing. I do not speak Crow, and sometimes I'm afraid that my ancestors cannot hear me, so I like the idea that they can see and understand what I'm trying to say through my art, and that's why I use a lot of the color red. So the next thing that I would like to talk about is the beaks of the handbirds, particularly why I often depict them as a really tiny beak and then they're kind of flying towards a larger beak. As you can see on the beginning of this painting over here with the badger pillar. So the Crow word for ourselves is Apsalaki, and this means children of the large-beaked bird, this was interpreted to mean crow, which is now the federally recognized name for the tribe. So when the birds are arranged to be flying towards a larger beak, like you can see over here, it's symbolic of my experience with tribal enrollment as a mixed-race individual. In that regard, my brother and I are the first in my mother's family to be denied enrollment to the Crow tribe due to the current blood quantum requirements. How many of you are familiar with the blood quantum? Good, that's actually a lot more than I was thinking. But I'll just give a brief description of it to provide some clarity and background for the rest of my work, because a lot of the work that I'm doing is about the blood quantum. So it's a pretty complicated system, and it works differently from tribe to tribe. It differs in the amount of blood that they require, whether they require it at all, and how they determine what each individual's fraction is. So I'd also like to mention that this is a pretty divisive topic among Native Americans at this time. And I'd like to clarify that I'm not speaking on behalf of Crow people or any other indigenous people, as they may have different ideas about it than I do, but I'm just speaking from my personal experience and the research that I've done about this topic. So at its most basic definition, the blood quantum is the percentage of native blood that an individual is recorded to possess. And before embarking on this research journey and the time I've dedicated towards learning about the blood quantum through this residency, I believed, like many others, and like the systems designed to make us think, that my blood quantum was literally the amount of indigenous blood that I have in my body. Thanks to the work of Dr. Kim Tallbear, Matika Wilbur, Dr. Adrienne Keene, and countless others, I now understand that this is far from the truth. The blood quantum was initially introduced to us by the federal government in an effort to limit our citizenship. The original writings, which we still refer to today, describe it quite crudely as a way to breed out the Indians. With no more indigenous people, we have no claims to our land, no claim to resources, no claim to aid, and treaty rights no longer have to be respected. And one thing that I was particularly disturbed by in my research of the blood quantum is that there's in fact no blood work done in configuring one's blood quantum. It's just visually sorted out by looking at your family tree and writing down fractions on paper. And you can see some of these fractions here in this piece that's hanging on the wooden thing over there. And the fractions are kind of interesting if you don't know the background behind them, because it looks silly, like the math doesn't add up. So things such as 1/2 plus 1/2 equals 1/4, or 1/4 plus 1/4 equals 1/8, or 1/4 plus 1/4 equals 0. And this is because the blood quantum isn't consistent across tribes, and a lot of tribes, such as the Crow tribe, don't include blood from other nations. So like in my personal experience, I'm also Arapaho and Sioux, but that doesn't go into my fraction that's recorded. So these fractions are broken down from the first batch of enrollees that were recorded in the United States Census. And tribal nations have always been a diverse group of citizens, but this first sentence suddenly racialized our people. And those on the original census roll were recorded as full-blood members of the tribe, but there wasn't anything scientific about it. It was just a construct for the purpose of dividing future generations and getting rid of indigenous people. So another way to look at this concept is by comparing it to perhaps a more familiar tool of oppression that was created by the federal government around the same time, and this is the one-drop rule. So this idea is that if an individual has 1 drop of black blood, that person's considered black, and it was used to exploit people into slavery and otherwise control their social mobility. So this is something that's often taught in history, but in my own experience in Western education, the blood quantum is hardly talked about at all, even though this frame of thought of the 1-drop rule is no longer legally or socially given much footing in the United States, but the blood quantum is strictly enforced by federal rule. It's a tool of oppression as well, but it's used to the opposite intention. So instead of categorizing more people as Native, the quantum seeks to get rid of indigenous people. And 1 drop of any other type of blood, be it a different type of tribe or any other race, is seen to dilute you, and you're suddenly viewed by your community as less Indian. The thing is that it's not uncommon for indigenous people to be mixed race, and the system actually relies on it. The quantum was designed for this purpose, and essentially to relieve the U.S. government of their obligations to treaty agreements. With no indigenous people left, the land would be available for them to do with it what they pleased. As sovereign nations today, however, it's in the hands of individual tribes to decide their own methods for determining enrollment. And for various reasons, some communities, such as mine, still choose to operate under the blood quantum system. And with research and understanding that the blood quantum has been following its original design and steadily diminishing the number of enrolled members, many tribes have begun making the switch back to pre-colonial methods such as kinship and family lineage. And this would work like the idea that because my mom is Crow and my grandparents are Crow and my great-grandparents are, then my brother and I would be considered Crow as well. And I'm in support of these more inclusive systems because I've directly felt the impacts of holding on to the blood quantum. I believe that being Indigenous is more about family, culture, tradition, giving back to your community than it is the idea of having pure blood. As sovereign nations, it's my firm belief that any nation which relies on constructs of ethnic purity, especially when these ideas are systematically classifying its citizens and oppressing them, it must be questioned and reformed. And that's why I make art about blood quantum. So, yeah, I just do a lot of thinking about how my ancestors survived really harsh winters in Montana. They survived disease, poverty, settler colonialism, and the decades following it filled with systematic racism. Like my grandmother and my great-grandmother were both sent to assimilative boarding schools. And I feel like it isn't fair for them to have gone through all of that, to have our family connection to the Crow tribe come to an end because of interracial love. And I don't want to be complacent in a system of cultural erasure, so I'm doing everything that I can to avoid it. And for me, that's making artwork about it. And it might sound like I'm getting caught up in terminology, so I'm really glad for all of you to listen to that kind of huge rant on federal Indian policy. But one thing that I'd like to note is that it's more than just your name on a list. It's more than an ID card, but it's a very tangible effect on the lives of Indigenous people to be disenrolled from the tribe. So because my brother and I are granted first descendant status, we're still medically and socially classified as Indigenous, but we're not allowed to vote in tribal affairs. We're not allowed to participate in certain traditions, and if we were to have children with someone outside of the tribe, or even with someone in the tribe who has a similar blood quantum to ourselves, our children wouldn't be considered Crow at all, and they wouldn't be able to receive medical care from services such as Indian Health Services. I feel like I'm using this art talk to spew about tribal law, but thank you for listening to my thoughts, and now that I've trapped all of you into learning about the blood quantum, we can talk more about the recurring imagery, and hopefully some of it will make more sense. So in that regard, another image that I like to incorporate into my work is this yellow mule here. The creature is depicted with this big old hole in its stomach. Poor fella. But it first emerged last fall at the University of Montana in a print of mine, which I'm really excited to announce it's being considered for the Smithsonian right now. I just found out they're having a meeting about it, so please validate me. But I was really afraid to make this print because I was raised with the belief that you shouldn't question your elders, no matter what the circumstances. But I've come to believe that a lot of the beliefs that they sorry, thank you, that's okay. A lot of the things that they've taught me, although I respect them deeply, I believe that they come from the boarding school era and the amount of oppression that they were forced to face during that time. So I started thinking about, when I was first making this yellow mule, I was thinking about how I'm kind of seen as this mixed up hybrid creature of Indigenous descent. I'm French and German and some other stuff. And because of that, some people no longer see me as Crow. And this mule speaks to this issue as well, because a mix of two creatures, mules are they're genetically unable to produce offspring. And while I'm granted first descendant status by the Crow, were I to have children with someone outside the tribe, they wouldn't be considered Crow. So in a way, I really relate to the idea of a hybrid mule creature, because I can't pass on enrollment to any hypothetical children that I might have. And I also thought about this mule because some of my relatives have the last name Yellow Mule. And when I was a kid, I'd always picture this type of mule, even though, I mean, it was probably in reference to a mule deer, but I like this type of mule, and I always kind of pictured it in my head. So in a way, the series is an homage to my family as well. Okay, so time to talk about the big painting. Like I said in the beginning, when I make work, it's usually about connection of some sort, and my main goal of this residency is to reconnect with my culture through the use of reclaimed materials. And I feel like this painting and the other one that I just started over there is one of the best ways that I've embodied this concept. It's tentatively titled, "What Does It Mean to Mend?" And the idea behind it is to designate specific time and energy to actively pursue connection to my family, our history, and the history of our ancestors. Because of the blood quantum and other things, I've sometimes felt this immense pressure all around me to let go of my indigeneity, that it's too small a fraction to count, that it shouldn't mean anything. And this is very frightening and horrible to me because, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of my experiences as a child were pretty imbued with traditional activities like beading with my mom and dancing in powwows and going to visit all of my cousins on the reservation. But there's all these external forces trying to get me to push away my indigeneity, and I feel that it's the responsibility of myself and the future generations to do everything that we can to mend and reclaim the parts of ourselves that have been cut away through settler colonialism. Like I briefly mentioned earlier, my grandma and my great-grandma were both sent to boarding schools, and as a result, my mom didn't get to learn our language. And my grandparents actually passed away when I was really young, so I didn't get to meet them as much as I would like to. But I think about them a lot with the work that I'm making these days. And I've been fortunate that in the Crow way, my mom's aunt and uncle are considered my grandparents as well, and they've acted as such for a lot of my life. Their names are Ron and Rosalind Yellowmule, and they've been really influential to me. When the virus wasn't going on, they'd come visit us in Bozeman for the powwow and for Easter and just other visiting times. They were going to come to my graduation this spring, but it wasn't safe to, so I haven't seen them in over a year. But anyways, they speak Crow, and the most that I've heard of the Crow language is from them. They'd speak to us when we were children, and I've always wanted to understand, but until now I felt kind of afraid to try to learn the language because my identity is pretty divisive among our community. To claim that I'm still Crow is controversial, but I've decided that I'm still going to connect to my family through this way. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about it and researching Indigenous is through researching Indigenous language revitalization. So one of my cousins is actually the president of the Little Bighorn College over in Crow, and I initially wanted to move down there for a while to dedicate time to learning the language. And that's what I was actually planning to do right after graduating, but with the disease and everything, it didn't seem like a good idea to. So I started researching online Indigenous language revival, and I've been listening to this podcast called All My Relations, and they have an episode about Indigenous language reclamation, and one of the concepts from that episode is the catalyst for this painting. They talk a lot about how when you're learning a language in English, you often start out by wanting to learn things like how to introduce yourself, or learning infinitives, or how to say things like cat or dog. But if you think about it, especially if you're like very socially afraid like me, you don't introduce yourself to people very much in a day. So they found that it's much more effective to do this concept, which is called a language nest. It was developed by the Maori people in New Zealand and then used by the Lushootseed people, and it's been really successful in creating new Indigenous speakers. And the idea is that you take a space in your house that you often interact with and dedicate it to practicing the language, and so you self-narrate your actions. Like if you choose the bathroom per se, then you brush your teeth in Crow and you get water in Crow. And everything that you do, you self-narrate to yourself until you get the language down around that concept, and then you can expand it until everything is your language nest, which I think is really beautiful. So I took that concept of dedicating a specific space or activity to learning, and I applied it more broadly to this painting. But instead of just the language, I've been using it as a space dedicated to reconnect to everything that I know about myself, my indigeneity, and my family. So I've been listening to recordings of the Crow language, listening to other Indigenous thinkers and poets and writers. I've been reflecting on my experiences, both good and bad, surrounding my Indigenous identity, and trying to reconnect with it from as many angles as I can. So what I did here is back to the color red and how it's the color that traditionally our ancestors can see. On this side of the canvas, I tried to use a lot of red, and I did lots of research into thinking about my history and my family tree, and I tried to practice beading on it and included elk's teeth, which are important to the Crow people, and they have lots of nostalgic value to me. And then on this half, I was thinking about my personal experiences, and especially like the difficult parts of being mixed race and not accepted by some of our community members as Indigenous. And I thought about how so many other people are in the same place as me across the United States and Canada for tribes who still use the blood quantum. and how I think that it's really necessary at this time to use all of the resources and knowledge that we can to mend the break that's been imposed on us by settler colonialism and restructure the ways that our societies are deciding who's an active member and who can participate in the future. So I tried to kind of symbolize that through using as many like crumbs of metal and string and things that I could find around Home Resource to draw together both sides of the canvas. And everything that is on here, aside from the beads and the elk teeth, are Home Resource materials. Like, this looks like a canvas, but it's actually made from wallpaper that was like all kind of funny and fleshy looking, and then I flipped it inside out and made a canvas out of it onto a wood structure. And yeah, I've been using that wallpaper for a lot of things. Like this yellow mule over here is on the wallpaper too. And I've really been enjoying using, reclaimed materials to get my art done and get my ideas across. Like this big badger is going to be a wood carving, and it's on a hollow door, so it's really light, and it otherwise could have ended up in the dump somewhere. So this is a smaller example that I practiced on, but I've been using my printmaking tools to like create these little paintings where I scoop away the wood to make these little creatures. Like this one's a bear and also a caterpillar, scientifically speaking. And that one is going to be a big badger, and also a little badger too. But so I guess to end my talk, I'd like to read a poem that I wrote this week while up in my nest at Home Resource, while I've been thinking about all of these things. It's inspired by a question that was raised by the Canadian poet Joshua Whitehead while speaking about his own work, and it relates back to the imagery that I just discussed about the handbirds with the small beaks trying to reach this idea of indigeneity that's like just outside of the bounds of their ability. So the question that I drew from is, how do you connect with a past which you were born illegible to? And I'm thinking about calling the poem Small Beaked Bird, Can My Ancestors Hear Me? So, Upsalaki, children of the large-beaked birds, crow. But what of the children of the large-beaked birds? What of their grandchildren and the children after that? What of my brother and what of me? Is my beak too small, no longer the shape of the crow? Will our ancestors still recognize me? I want to ask, and I try to form the words of our language, but they were ripped from the tongues of those who taught me how to speak, and now I'm afraid. Is it too small to form the words, Shodashi, Kahe, it's me, your family. Sorry for the squeakiness. I'm like so nervous, but I'm really glad that you all listened. And now I'd like to open it up if there's any questions or things that you'd like me to talk more about. You know, that's actually a good story, because I'm actually like mortally terrified of caterpillars, which I think you all should be too. Yeah, I've just been really afraid of them since I was a kid. I think because I'm like emotionally frail and I care a lot about animals. Like, I started being vegetarian when I was 10, and like, I'm really afraid of popping them, which is like, they're gonna pop if you touch them too hard. And then it's like also for selfish reasons, because it's like yucky if they pop on you, I'm guessing. I've never had it happen. But yeah, like I said earlier, I studied psychology also, and I was reading about phobias for, again, selfish reasons. Like, I was like, I gotta get over this caterpillar fear because it's embarrassing, and I was like afraid to go mountain biking if I might squish the cat. It got really out of hand. I was like, I'm gonna squish the caterpillars, but so I thought about exposure therapy is one of the best ways to get rid of fear. So I was like looking up all these pictures of just horrifying caterpillars in my spare time, and it actually worked. Like, I'm like way less afraid of them, and I can go mountain biking again. And now I just think they're kind of cute. So, yep.
I'm sitting there thinking how to phrase this properly, because to even ask it almost gives a negative connotation. But the closest way to get efficient to ask is, what are your thoughts on what is generally called cultural appropriation? And I guess I'd fill that up by saying, let's say that there are people who grew up without any family connection to an indigenous, and it may not be Native American, it might be from Africa, maybe somewhere else, maybe Maori, but they study it in books, or they are aware of it through the web, and they find certain aspects intriguing, and they want to approach something like that with respect, and it may at times then be commingled with material things such as art or clothing in some ways, and so I'm just curious about your thoughts about that.
Cultural appropriation is actually something I've done a lot of thinking about, mostly like as a kid being really insecure, like what if I'm not indigenous, and like I wore moccasins and stuff until I was in kindergarten, which now I realize is because I'm indigenous. But I also, like with making beadwork and stuff, I'd give it to my friends a lot growing up, and they'd raise this question to me, like, is it appropriation if I wear your beadwork and I'm living in Bozeman and I'm not indigenous? And to me, I don't think that's the same as cultural appropriation, because appropriation to me implies a lack of consent, and it's, I think, especially problematic if there are people with no connection to the culture and they're taking aspects of it, picking and choosing that they find interesting, and then recreating them themselves without any, without any knowledge or speaking to the person who they're drawing from to ask if it's all right. I think that is what can be damaging, especially if it's like a corporation or something and they're profiting off of indigenous design without anything going back to the community that it came from. I feel like I'm getting kind of sidetracked, but a really good resource if you want to learn more about cultural appropriation is one of the resources I frantically mentioned earlier in my big speech. Her name is Dr. Adrienne Keene, and she specializes in cultural anthropology. She has a blog called Cultural Appropriations, and she goes through and points out all of these things that are in mainstream society that appropriate from indigenous people, and talks about why they're problematic, or in certain circumstances why something that might seem like cultural appropriation is actually not appropriative and it's okay. And I think that's a really valuable resource as an indigenous person to read about, and also as a non-indigenous person if you're trying to be a good ally and learn. Yes. Yeah, well, it's definitely, the Crow Reservation's kind of outside Billings, so if you picture brown, flat sadness, no, don't quote me on that, but yeah, there's definitely, greens are used as well, but not traditionally in beadwork, as much as yellows and blues and whites and pinks, and that might be more from a lot of the work that I'm looking at is from my mom, so I'll have to ask her about it and get back to you if it's a personal preference or something that's been taught to her from a cultural standpoint. But I know that in the time that I've dedicated towards researching color, green I haven't actually found a lot of meaning for, except for I know through literary perspectives from Western academia, green is spring and rebirth and revitalization, so I think about that when I use it, but that might be more from my perspective of living in Missoula and Bozeman. Did you have a question to her? I think that's a really good question, because aside from speaking with my grandparents, I didn't have a lot of contact with the Crow language other than through song, because my family would always go to powwows and listen to traditional music, and when we were little kids my brother would drum, and that's definitely really impactful in my interest in the culture and the language. And I think that music is a really powerful tool, like you said, for conveying emotion across all languages and cultures. So yeah, I'm definitely really interested in listening to the music. And while I was working on this, I Googled like MSU powwow songs, like, because I couldn't remember. But there's a lot of great groups around Bozeman and Crow Agency and here in Missoula and all sorts of places that are still practicing traditional music. And I think that's really important. But throughout this whole journey, I've also, like, by accident ended up moving next door to other indigenous people, and they're here today, but they became my really good friends, and we started a band called Crybaby in town. And we don't use a lot of traditional music, but we use music to talk about like shared experiences that we've had living in Missoula as indigenous people and like issues that we want to address. So I think music is definitely an important tool for art and otherwise. Yeah, that's a great question. I have a lot of different ways of art making. Like, and I feel like the project that I have in mind really affects the process that I create it with. So some of the things that I'm doing more for fun, like these badger pillars and things, I just like think of an idea and of something that I think would be kind of like funny and interesting to explore, and then I'll just jump straight into the project. But other things, yeah, I do a lot of thinking about first, and I'll have an idea of a issue that I want to address, and I'll think about it for like a suspiciously long time, and like write a bunch of notes about it, and do lots of thinking, and then I'll go to like a big canvas like this, and then I'll kind of stop thinking about it for a little bit, and like pick out all of the colors that I guess it's just kind of intuitive in that way, just colors that speak to me for the emotional process of whatever issue it is that I'm trying to address. And then I'll just like think about the research while I'm creating kind of abstract art. So to me, like each line is representative of like a different topic that I was thinking about. So I kind of like it because it's like a secret, because I know what like this splotch means, but then no one else knows. If that makes sense. It's like, yeah, I guess kind of like a personal exploration. Like the experience of making the art is just as important to me as the end product. Yeah. 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 I think especially over the past year, as you could probably tell from my artist talk, I got like really into the research side of my art and like thinking heavily in conceptual basis. And I think it was really, really helpful for me to have this residency because it pushed me out of that in some ways. And I kind of was inspired to try things like just art based on color without any meaning. Or, I mean, you can always insert meaning if you want to, but just colors that I liked and I thought they worked well together, and interesting materials here at Home Resource. So some days if I was like, especially with the way that like the political climate is right now, some days I'd get really discouraged and not want to think about these difficult things. So it was really helpful to me to come here and just like be surrounded by aesthetically beautiful things and know that I wasn't going to be causing any more waste by creating art with them. Like this piece down here, it's like a blue frame with a bunch of mesh and metal. It's all reused materials from here, and with that one, I made kind of a point to myself about like not thinking about any of these issues that were really affecting my art practice in my life, and just drawing from the materials that are around me and trying to really immerse myself in the experience of being an artist in residence here. And I think that's going to be helpful for me to like have a new way and a new process of making work that's more aesthetically based. Oh, in painting. Actually when I was a really little kid, I always loved painting, and yeah, like basically all that I can remember about my whole life. Okay, I remember other things, but like the most like important part of my identity has always been being an artist. Even when I was a kid, I was like very sure that that's what I wanted to do. So I'd like paint a really poopy hand painting and then be like really proud of it and like, look, Mom, I'm famous. um, yeah. So yeah, my parents have kept a lot of my art from when I was just like a little baby, and I like to look at it now, and it's like definitely not very good, but fun to look at. And I've actually been like kind of trying to draw from like some of the marks that I made when I was like really small, and like incorporate them into my work right now. Like a lot of this is done actually with like finger painting, which we found this old VHS tape of like my brother and I as kids, and we were just like creating this horrible mess of finger painting, and I was like, that looks like really fun. I'm kind of stressed out. I'm gonna do that. And then I made the elk's teeth with my thumbprints, so it's good. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Oh, so
Thank
awkward.
you, Stella. That was wonderful, and my intro really paled in comparison to your rich sharing about your artwork. Thank you so much.